you have the ostensibly liberal MSNBC, they had any number of these so-called liberal commentators like this Donny Deutsch, who would get wrought and emotional about, they were baking babies in ovens, total lie. They were conducting mass rapes, total lie. This is a Holocaust, and there are people out there who are defending this, who are calling for a Holocaust. This lie, this deliberately manipulation of emotions, is then, of course, serves to justify whatever Israel does. I mean, you can pretty much say, "Oh, hey, look what happened in this camp. 70 people died. Babies beheaded through this, through this attack. Men carrying, with little children in their arms. It's justified because, well, it's a Holocaust. We got to stop the Holocaust."
And so this is not new, and we've touched on this beforehand about the media's role in all of this. I mean, if you go back to 1917, during the First World War, British newspapers such as the Times and the Mail, they ran this gruesome story, you'll probably recall, claiming that the Germans were extracting fat from bodies of dead soldiers on both sides of the war to make soap and margarine. And I've looked at some of the headlines of that, and actually this story came from an official government department and was spread to the press. They knew the story wasn't true, but basically what it did was persuade readers that the Germans were a barbaric enemy and convinced many that they had to be defeated. Martin, you've worked in the media for many years. What's your take on it?
Yeah, but I wasn't working in 1917. I'm not that old, but I do.
A tough paper round, I think they said.
If I do remember 1991, when the Americans were poised to invade Kuwait to kick the Iraqis out, that we heard reports of babies being burnt in ovens, or babies being raped, or something like that, and it turned and something that George Bush Sr. put out. It turned out, sometime later was completely fabricated, totally. I think, but it's our fault. I mean, it's the British fault. We did invent disinformation in the First World War, and in the Second World War, we set up disinformation intelligence departments within our secret services, and the Americans then learned all the tricks, and before you could say, get the curry on, we found in the late 40s and the early 50s, the Americans had got white propaganda off to a fine art, with lots and lots of articles in the big newspapers about South American and Central American countries, which America wanted to adopt closer relations with. And, these white propaganda articles, it grew and grew. And then we have black propaganda, which I experienced probably in every single conflict I've ever covered. I mean, I think I've been in 7 or 8 conflicts in my career, and wherever I've done, I've always stumbled across Americans, usually in uniforms, unarmed, dealing with disinformation, wherever I've been. A subject very close to George's heart is Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia. I was there in the latter part of it, just in the last year before Tuđman, the president of Croatia, who died. And, the Americans installed themselves in Zagreb. They built a disinformation center for journalists, for international journalists, and they started publishing articles in the New York Times and in the Post, basically creating this image that the Croatians were angels. They had blue eyes and they have blonde hair and they've got our values, and they sort of watch the same TV shows as us and eat the same food and go to church on Sunday. And Milosevic, by contrast, was the devil, and that we need to destroy him, basically, And what they probably didn't mention or forgot to mention, and the history lesson, I'm sure George will tell you in more detail, is that you only have to just take a cursory glance at history to know that the Croatians actually slaughtered something like 100,000 or more Serbians during the Second World War. And the Croatians were, Hitler described the Croatians as, the best Nazis he had. He didn't need to send his SS troops to Croatia to do the slaughtering of Serbians and Gypsies and Jews. And so to this day, if you have that context, if you have that nuance, you begin to understand Milosevic, you begin to understand why he was a nationalist and why he behaved the way he did. But I saw that, I witnessed that firsthand. And, these were just lies. And what you also find, I saw it again with Syria, when I was based in Beirut, you had a lot of reports about Assad bombing his own people. Turns out to be complete BS, total BS. And it's been disproved so many times since then. But, it's too late. I mean, at the time, I witnessed in Beirut just flocks and flocks of British journalists coming over from London, spending the night in Beirut, and then getting on and getting into Syria, usually from the north. And what everybody had to do was basically embed themselves with Al-Qaeda or ISIS terrorist operations, terrorist cells. That was the only way to get in, is you had to embed yourself with those groups. And of course, those groups, we learned years later, had their own agenda. They had their own way of manipulating journalists. They would take these Western journalists in with them, give them somewhere to sleep, feed them, protect them, apparently. And then slowly the disinformation starts to be fed to them, and they don't have any choice. They've got to report something, And what we discovered was a lot. I would say the lion's share of what came out of Syria in all those years was complete nonsense, Andrew, total nonsense. All of those stories about Assad bombing his own people with sarin, nonsense. Worse than that, more nefarious, more shocking, was that actually this whole story was cooked up by British intelligence, and that we, the Brits, had actually a number of Al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliates on our payroll, who SAS soldiers were training to set these fake attacks up, so that, journalists based in Beirut basically just had the story packaged for them. There was another famous so-called chemical attack in Ghouta, which BBC ran video footage of people suffering, people running around screaming, children screaming that they were on fire, And this was put out as a story. Assad bombed his own children, bombed his own kids again, and it was an awful. It turned out a few weeks later, it was rumbled that the children who were being filmed were all acting. They were actors, all of it. The whole thing was staged, And this happened just time and time again with Syria and nearly all of the conflict zones I've been to. I just see the same thing happening again and again. You have mainstream media don't really want to sell newspapers anymore because the business model has changed. 30 years ago, you wanted to break a story and you didn't care who it upset because it sold newspapers and it, made financial sense for the big media owners. Now, I think in the last 15 or 20 years, certainly in my career, I've noticed that we've all become now part of the establishment. Media is now part of the establishment. And that media is an extension of the intelligence services of government. And it's guys like me who are phoning up the Daily Mail, and with great stories now, just getting our stories turned down time and time again because they don't fit into the narrative. They don't fit into what the newspapers have aligned themselves to, which is basically fake news, And the thing is, what's interesting, though, I think for your viewers is people don't realize it. They don't realize that so much of this is going on. They don't realize that what they watch every night on Ukraine, for example, is again, entirely fake news because all the British journalists there are aligning themselves with the institution of the Ukrainian government, its press service. They're not free to go anywhere they want to go. They have to get permission. They have to have minders with them. Those minders take them to certain places, and arrange the stories for them. And so you don't get any real objective reporting. You don't get proper analysis at all. And even if you were allowed to, I wouldn't think many journalists would even do that anyway. And so British people, for example, have got a completely skewered idea of the Ukraine war. They don't really understand what the Ukraine war is about because of this fake news now agenda, which has got completely out of control. And unfortunately, what happens is when the superstate, when Big Brother sees that media are so willing to go along with whatever is fed to them, then the temptation for governments and for intelligence agencies to actually play with the theatre of war and set things up for journalists is too much. And I saw that a lot in Syria. I saw that in Afghanistan when I was there. A similar story in Iraq and certainly Ukraine today. And, what we're seeing also now is a number of popular stories coming through, about Nord Stream pipeline, for example, which journalists refused to acknowledge could possibly be even Western interference, stories about electric cars, about the environment, all of these stories, which are really just leading us down the garden path. They've been planted because journalists and media are in cahoots with with Big Brother, with the superstate, and also big companies, the industrial military complex, and huge organizations. That what we're seeing now in media is, I would say, almost entirely fake. I would go as far as to say is 90% of what we're reading in the newspapers now is worse than fake. It's nefarious, it's disingenuous, and you've got to buy electric cars, and well, where's the evidence for that? We've got to go to war with Russia. Why? Because Russia is going to invade us. Well, where's the evidence for that? It's like media journalists no more need evidence. They don't need anything to substantiate these wild claims. We're being led down the garden path, and where's it all heading? In the last couple of years, two massive world wars now are erupting. I'm waiting for the third one, and I know that it will be media again, which will be, I think, responsible for even it starting.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. We are living in a diseased information age, and as they rightly said, if you don't read the newspapers, you're ill-informed, and if you read them, you're misinformed.